Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's wrap up week 68 with Silmarillion Saturday. Now, these Saturdays are our chance to revisit the history and legends of the Elder Days, whether from the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or more. And today we continue the Akallabêth in the Silmarillion, where last time we saw Númenor visited by what were essentially biblical plagues, and yet Ar-Pharazôn hardened his heart. Today, well, the world changes forever today. But the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn came up out of the deeps of the sea and encompassed Avallon and all the Isle of Eressëa, and the Eldar mourned, for the light of the setting sun was cut off by the cloud of the Númenorians. And at last Ar-Pharazôn came even to Aman, the Blessed Realm, and the coasts of Valinor. And still all was silent, and doom hung by a thread. For Ar-Pharazôn wavered at the end, and almost he turned back. His heart misgave him when he looked upon the soundless shores and saw Taniquetil shining, whiter than snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Ilúvatar. But pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship and strode upon the shore, claiming the land for his own if none should do battle for it. And a host of the Númenorians encamped in might about Tuna, whence all the Eldar had fled. Then Manwë upon the mountain called upon Ilúvatar, and for that time the Valar laid down their government of Arda. But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world, and a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the deathless lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken. And all the fleets of the Númenorians were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. But Ar-Pharazôn the king and the mortal warriors that had set foot upon the land of Aman were buried under falling hills. There it is said that they lie imprisoned in the caves of the forgotten until the last battle and the day of doom. But the land of Aman and Eressëa of the Eldar were taken away and removed beyond the reach of men forever. And Andor, the land of gift, Númenor of the kings, Elenna of the star of Eärendil, was utterly destroyed. For it was nigh to the east of the great rift, and its foundations were overturned, and it fell and went down into darkness, and is no more. And there is not now upon earth any place abiding where the memory of a time without evil is preserved. For Ilúvatar cast back the great seas west of Middle-earth, and the empty lands east of it, and new lands and new seas were made, and the world was diminished. For Valinor and Eressëa were taken from it into the realm of hidden things. In an hour unlooked for by men this doom befell, on the 39th day since the passing of the fleets. Then, suddenly, fire burst forth from the Meneltarma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled, and the hills slid, and Númenor went down into the sea with all its children, and its wives, and its maidens, and its ladies proud, and all its gardens, and its halls, and its towers, its tombs, and its riches, and its jewels, and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth, and its music, its wisdom, and its lore. They vanished forever. And last of all, the mounting wave, green and cold, and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, took to its bosom Tar-Miriel the queen, fairer than silver or ivory or pearls. Too late she strove to ascend the steep ways of the Meneltarma to the holy place, for the waters overtook her, and her cry was lost in the roaring of the wind. But whether or no it were that Amandil came indeed to Valinor, and Manwë hearkened to his prayer, By grace of the Valar, Elendil and his sons and their people were spared from the ruin of that day. For Elendil had remained in Romenna, refusing the summons of the king when he set forth to war, and avoiding the soldiers of Sauron that came to seize him and drag him to the fires of the temple. He went aboard his ship and stood off from the shore, waiting on the time. There he was protected by the land from the great draught of the sea that drew all towards the abyss, and afterwards he was sheltered from the first fury of the storm. But when the devouring wave rolled over the land and Númenor toppled to its fall, then he would have been overwhelmed and would have deemed it the lesser grief to perish, for no wrench of death could be more bitter than the loss and agony of that day. But the great wind took him, wilder than any wind that men had known, roaring from the west, and it swept his ships far away, and it rent their sails and snapped their masts, hunting the unhappy men like straws upon the water. 9 ships there were, 4 for Elendil, and for Isildur 3, and for Anarion 2. And they fled before the black gale out of the twilight of doom into the darkness of the world. And the deeps rose beneath them in towering anger, and waves like unto mountains moving with great caps of writhen snow bore them up amid the wreckage of the clouds, and after many days cast them away upon the shores of Middle-earth. And all the coasts and seaward regions of the western world suffered great change and ruin in that time. For the seas invaded the lands, and shores foundered, and ancient isles were drowned, and new isles were uplifted, and hills crumbled, and rivers were turned into strange courses. There are a few stories in Tolkien that, no matter how many times I read them, I'm begging them to end differently. The death of Beleg Cuthalion, for one. Just about everything in the Children of Húrin, actually. And this one. I can't help wondering what would have happened had Ar-Pharazôn changed his mind and repented. I mean, the truth is, I don't know that it would have done anything but postpone the inevitable. The king's men were under Sauron's thumb now, and even if this king rejected all this, the next guy would have done the same. But still, I just keep rooting for him to say, you know what, maybe this eternal life thing isn't really it's all cracked up to be. I think I'm just going to hop back on my ship and head home. It's a nice place after all. I mean, I'm king there. But he doesn't. Pride was now his master, as the text says, but really, Sauron was his master. Now, back in episode 46 of the Prancing Pony podcast, all the way back in season 1, when Sean and I looked over this story, I did a quick sidebar on the potential distance between Númenor and Aman, based on the 39 days that it took his armada to travel there. So let's go back in time more than 7 years and see how that sidebar, that analysis, holds up. Tolkien never gave us the distance between Númenor and Tol Eressëa explicitly at any point. So I'm going to do what I do when I don't have the data. I'm going to speculate. Now, we just read it took his armada 39 days to travel from Númenor to Aman. Well, presumably there were no layovers and they weren't stopping for food at every other exit. And it still took them almost 6 weeks. So let's look at some real history for comparison. Pliny the Elder left some very detailed records regarding trips by boat in the 1st century AD. Now, even back then, they averaged between 4.5 to 6 knots under sail. And remember, the Númenorians are mariners whose like shall never be again, so they're pretty handy with a boat. If we calculate conservatively then, Númenor would be about 4,700 nautical miles. That's over 5,300 miles away from Aman. That's the distance between London and LA, the opposite side of the continent. But let's assume that the wind that wafted them away in the first morning died off and they could only do, let's say, 3 knots. And maybe even say that Ar-Pharazôn's hesitation at the end of the trip was an entire day's worth of, should we really do this? That would still put them over 2,700 nautical miles, or about 3,100 miles away, almost the distance from London to New York. Now, a couple more notes, courtesy of Sean's observations back then. More anti-Eärendil cues. First, Eärendil came ashore in humility, walked alone in the streets of Valmar, and he was greeted only when he turned back to leave. Ar-Pharazôn has a chance to turn back, but doesn't, and he walks ashore in pride. And then there's the punishment. Punishment that I say fits the crime. This goes in the Hall of Ironic Punishments for sure. You want immortality? You've got it. Just in the caves of the forgotten for millennia. And compare being buried under rocks to carrying a star on your brow and sailing the skies to light the world. Can't get much different than that. I also love the hint that maybe, just maybe, Amandil made it to Valinor after all. Sure, there's no absolution for the treason of Númenor, we get that, but maybe there's salvation for Amandil's people, for the faithful of Númenor who had been risking their lives for generations now. And finally, to go back to the plethora of biblical references, Tolkien tells us that if we see Elendil a little bit like Noah, we're not wrong. In letter 131 to Milton Waldman, he describes Elendil as a Noachian figure, and in letter 156 he writes, in a kind of Noachian situation, the small party of the faithful in Númenor who had refused to take part in the rebellion, though many of them had been sacrificed in the temple by the Sauronians, escaped in 9 ships under the leadership of Elendil and his sons. Folks, that does it for this week's Silmarillion Saturday. Thank you for joining me, and please come back next week as we read about the founding of Gondor and Arnor, the realms in exile, and their continuing fight against Sauron as we conclude the Akallabêth. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can get an ad-free feed, bonus episodes, and be a part of my content council to help decide what I'm going to talk about when I'm done with the Akallabêth. And please, if you're watching this on YouTube, you know the drill. Like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow at Tolkien Times on social media. Tell everybody about it. Give us reviews, whatever it takes. Thank you for all that you do in listening. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.